Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. There are a couple of questions in the question and answer box. Don't worry, your mics are working. The event will begin at 8:35 p.m. in 1 minute. Hello, everyone. It's 8:35 p.m. India time. Welcome to Stories from Wave 22 of Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. I work at CMI, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, and my job is to help make the record level data from the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey available to researchers. I'm joined by Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is the MD and CEO of CMI. Mahesh is also the chief architect of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. The two of us will take the next hour and 24 minutes to tell you about some of the stories from the most recent wave of CPHS, which was completed on the 31st of April. For those of you who are here for your first time, the best way to experience this event is to understand that it's very interactive. Please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask as many questions as you wish. While I'm presenting, Mahesh will try and answer as many questions as possible. If there are any questions left over at the end, we will try and go over them then. It's now 1 minute past 8:35, so we will start the show. One last message is that in case we overflow our 500 attendee cap on Zoom, you will be prompted with the option to sign out and immediately be redirected to the YouTube live stream. The content is exactly the same. There is no difference at all. If you prefer to watch it on the YouTube live stream, you're more than welcome to. Okay, I'm going to do a quick video check. Mahesh, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can see it, Kaushik.
All right, great. We'll get the show on the road then. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This is Stories from Wave 22 of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Wave 22 was from January to April of 2021. That's this year. Some of you are joining us for the first time. Many of you have come to our events before. But for those of you for whom it is your first time, you may be wondering what CPHS is. You may know a little bit about CPHS, but you may be eager to know a little bit more. So before we dive into the stories from Wave 22, let me tell you a little bit about what CPHS is. To put it very simply, CPHS is India's largest regular household survey. Full stop. There is no regular household survey conducted in India by anybody that is larger than ours. What also sets CPHS apart is that we are a household panel survey or a longitudinal survey. What that means is that we track the same household over time. Once a household joins our survey panel, we interview the household each wave of the survey. That makes the survey even more unique and even more useful, because not only do you get to see a rolling picture of what's happening in India, you get to study individual households and individual members in those households, and you see how they change over time. As a household panel survey, not only are we India's largest, we're also the world's largest household panel survey. Let me give you some numbers to put context to this. The most important number in today's discussion is that we have already conducted 22 rounds or 22 waves of this survey. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. In terms of it being the largest household survey, the largest household panel survey, you might be wondering what the size of the survey actually is. We survey over 175,000 households, and these households are selected from the length and breadth of India. We've done detailed discussions, and there's a lot of documentation on our website already on the survey design. Suffice it to say for now, our survey is designed in such a way that we are able to create representative estimates of all of India, and we survey the landmass of India that contributes to 98.5% of India's population. So if you can think of a state and a district, we are almost surely there surveying households in both rural and urban parts of that district. The survey is very detailed. We conduct 3 rounds of the survey every year. In each round of the survey, we ask over 600 questions to these households and capture that information, and that information is made available at the unit level for researchers to study. So it's no surprise that there are over 30 research papers that have been written using CPHS. This number is increasing by the week, by the month, and we are really, really glad to see the amount of research output that has come out of CPHS. That's all I'm going to give you today as an introduction about CPHS. If you're interested in learning more, please go to our YouTube channel. We've done lots of talks about CPHS, the survey design of CPHS, what we capture, what we cover. None of that is really the subject matter of today's talk. Today's talk, like I said, is about studying one of these 22 waves. First, I need to explain to you the wave structure of CPHS. We started on the 1st of January in 2014. That was our first wave. Our second wave was on the 1st of May 2014. And our third wave was on the 1st of September 2014. Each wave takes 4 months to complete. So the survey runs throughout the year. This same cadence of 3 waves a year, the first starting in January, the second starting in May, the third starting in September, was carried over every single year from 2014. That's 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and now finally in 2021, wave 22 was the round of the survey that we have just completed. That was from January to April of this year. And the stories that we're about to tell you are stories from that wave. Stories from wave 22, again, are stories pertaining to the round of CPHS that we conducted from the 1st of January of this year to the 30th of April this year. Let me tell you quickly what the stories are that we're going to talk about today. First one is about the increased sample size of the survey. The second is about the increased response rates in the survey. The third is that we managed to maintain balance across many dimensions in the survey. Now let's take a pause. There are 3 more stories, but they're different. The fourth story is a story not about how we ran the survey, but about something that we learned after having conducted the survey when we analyzed the data. It's about depressed incomes in households across India. The fifth one is about weak consumer demand. And the sixth one is about how where you work matters to the kind of job that you have. Now, why tell you any stories at all? And why tell you these stories? The reason is really twofold. The data from CPHS is used in 2 distinct and different things. The first and the most important use of CPHS data is in a subscription service that CMI maintains called Consumer Pyramids DX. CPDX for short is a service that allows researchers anywhere in the world to download the data from CPHS and analyze it. The other way in which CPHS data is used is that we at CMI internally analyze this data and produce analysis through CMI services such as Economic Outlook that some of you might subscribe to. You might know, for example, that Mahesh Vyas writes weekly on unemployment and employment in India, as well as on consumer sentiments in India. Both for researchers as well as the people that consume the analysis that's done using CPHS data by CMI, there's an interest to know that the survey is run well. So the first three stories that we're going to talk to you about today are stories that are designed to give you the confidence that not only is the survey design good, because we've covered that in great detail in our previous talks, but given a good survey design, our execution is also very good. And so the first three stories are three short stories to help you understand that the quality of survey execution in Wave 22 was good. The next three stories are stories that you may not yet have seen either by researchers or by the work that CMI does. They are very exploratory, but the intention of showing you these stories is to suggest the many potential uses that CPHS has that are still very nascent and that really exist as opportunities for all of you as researchers, those of you that have joined us today. So with that as a background, I'd like to start with the first of these stories, increased sample size. This is a pretty simple and straightforward story. The sample size in Wave 22 was 176,671 households. That's really large. But what's even more incredible is that this is an increase compared to the previous wave of 2,256 households. This is the first increase that we've done to the sample in CPHS since Wave 16, which was way back in 2019. In 2020, we weren't able to do a sample expansion because we had to conduct the survey uninterrupted through the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns that followed, and we had our hands quite full with that. So in Wave 22, we finally expanded the survey and increased the sample size by 2,000 odd households. Now you might ask, where are these households located? And so these households are clustered in 3 states, in Andhra Pradesh, in Karnataka, and Telangana. Approximately 850 households added to the sample in Andhra Pradesh, 830 in Karnataka, and 580 approximately in Telangana. Why these 3 states? Well, this was done to offset something that we noticed in the survey, which is that these 3 states seem to have been exhibiting a certain kind of slightly increased non-response in their urban regions. And to offset that, we bumped up the sample in these 3 states. This is just the beginning of our sample expansion exercise. We're in the middle of Wave 23 as I speak. And in Wave 23, we're going to continue to expand the sample. So next wave, when we do another version of this talk, there's going to be a lot here to discuss about how we've expanded the sample even further and the implications that might have for you as researchers or consumers of information coming out of CPHS. For now, though, we can move to question 2, which is what happened to response rates? The answer is that they increased compared to Wave 21. The response rate in Wave 22 was 73.44%. As I said, that's an increase from Wave 21 of 2.8 percentage points. It is still lower than our historical average. Historically, we averaged between 80 to 85% as a response rate in the survey. That fell, as many of you know, due to COVID and has been rising steadily since then. We're now at 73.44% in Wave 22. And in fact, we might have even been higher. If you look at the monthly response rates, in January, February, and March, we were very close to 80%. As all of you know, by late March and through April, the next wave of lockdowns in India began, and that pulled down our response rate again. And so we have a slightly lower response rate for March and even lower response rate in April of 60%. We are still on track, and we continue with our experience of having surveyed through all of the lockdowns of last year. We continue to make strides, and we're confident that Wave 23 will deliver a very good response rate. Some other questions that you might have when you think about response rates. Many researchers have asked us how many of the responses of the interviews that you conduct are actually face-to-face interviews. In peacetime, in regular serving operations, 100% of our interviews are face-to-face. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, due to the lockdowns, as many of you know, in 2020, we transitioned to phone surveys until we were able to safely conduct face-to-face surveys again. In wave 22, which is January to April of this year, 97.59% of our surveys, of our interviews, were conducted face-to-face or in person. Again, if you look at the numbers from a monthly perspective, it was almost 100% in January, February, and March. In April, as lockdowns were imposed, we had to cut back on our face-to-face interviews in many parts of India, which is why we ended up with a lower number in April of 93.84%. As conditions get safe, and as it's possible for us to expand our face-to-face interview operations, we are very hopeful that this number will start to rise again. Next up, a question that often gets asked is, well, if your response rate was only 73% or 74%, what does that tell us about what's going on with the other households that haven't responded? Now, as many of you know, the biggest reason for the response rate not being even higher, not even closer to 85%, is because we chose as CMI to conduct survey operations at a level that we can handle and at a level where we can stay faithful to the survey design. That's what ensures that the final data that are collected through the survey are actually representative and can be used by researchers. There can be many reasons for household non-response, for non-response in the interviews. Only one of them has to do with the household actually refusing. So even though we have, say, about 14 or 15%, about 20 or 25% non-response, only 1.46% of all households actually refused the survey. Again, if you look at this number on a monthly scale, the number is very small and fairly stable. This is consistent even in previous waves. A very small fraction of households actually refuse to be surveyed or refuse to be interviewed. It's much more often the case that the stringent protocols that we have in place for interviewing put limits on how many interviews we can do in a day, especially when we have to manage the logistics that are involved in conducting survey operations during a pandemic. Okay, having gone through both the increase in sample size as well as the increased response rates and taking you through some of the nuances of that higher response rate, I want to now turn to the balance of the responses coming in. There's a larger sample, there's a better response rate, it seems to be well distributed, there doesn't seem to be a lot of non-response because of household refusal, so you finally end up with a bunch of households that do respond. Now, what do we know about those households? And can we convince ourselves that studying those households is meaningful if we're trying to create a picture of India? The first thing to note is that in wave 22, 68.1% of all households interviewed were urban households. Now, this may seem high to some newcomers at today's talk, but our survey design itself implies that the proportion of households that should be surveyed are 64.45% of the total sample. Now, the reason for this is that this is a function of our sample, of our survey design, and this takes some time to unpack and some time to explain. So if you want to know more about why the survey design implies that the proportion of urban households in the sample should be 64.45%, please do go to our YouTube channel, go to our website, check out the other talks and the documentation that we have on survey design. But for now, take as given that 64.45% is the number that we want to hit. We got pretty close to that number. We were at 68.1% urban households interviewed. And if you look at how, again, that number was broken up across the months, things were looking very good in January, February, and March. There was elevated urban responses in April, and that is due, of course, to the difficulties of logistical management, especially in rural areas, and that became even more exacerbated when the second wave of lockdowns began. Despite that, we've managed to really keep the fraction of urban households interviewed quite close to the number that we want to hit, which is 64.5% approximately. Another way to look at balance is to look at statewide balance. The bars that you see tell you in the sample how many households should be surveyed from the different states of India. And the degree to which they're filled up tell you how many responses we actually got from those states against the sample for those states. So there are some stories here. If you were to look, for example, at the very small states, states like Jammu and Kashmir, Goa, and Sikkim, response rates are low. There are two reasons for that. The first is with states like Jammu and Kashmir and Sikkim, it's logistically very difficult, even during the best of times, to be able to survey those regions. And during COVID and during the pandemic, when you have a smaller sample size, the difficulty you have less maneuverability in being able to manage the logistics of the survey there to ensure that you have balance within the state. And so you can see that in Jammu and Kashmir and Sikkim, we had low response rates, higher response rates in Goa at 46%, but still lower than the national average of about 74%. Next up, there are larger states like Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, and Odisha. In Tamil Nadu, it was actually quite high, almost 60%, but still lower than the 74% national average. And West Bengal and Odisha were even further off the mark at 46.75% and 42% respectively. There are many reasons for this. We are investigating those reasons, and as we understand them better, we're going to write about them on our website, like some of the articles that are already available. One of the things to note, of course, is that in both Tamil Nadu as well as in West Bengal, this was in the run-up to the state elections that can have a certain impact on response rates. Also, we are still not out of the shadow of COVID. And so in different states, we continue to face difficulties in being really able to make complete inroads into those states again as the COVID-19 pandemic continues. Next up are the states of Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Telangana. Those have response rates between 60 and 70%. Good. And they will get better. But the big takeaway here is that the majority of states have response rates of 70% or above. Large states like UP, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Punjab, Haryana, Bihar, all have very, very high response rates over 70%. So there are states that have lower response rates. There are reasons for those. We continue to investigate those reasons. And as we understand what happens, that helps us in improving our own survey methodology. Please stay tuned for announcements on our website as we put out more information on what happened as we study different states. Okay, now another way in which we want to understand balance is whether we are getting enough households from across India in different buckets of India. Now, this isn't a function of survey design. We don't say that one of the cornerstones of the survey is that there have to be so many people from each income group, or that there have to be so many people from each occupation group or education group. But if we did the survey well, and if we did believe in the survey design, we should expect that there's a fair amount of balance in households from different income groups, different occupation groups, different education groups that actually respond to the survey. As you can see, that is in fact the case. So even though we had a lower response rate of 74% compared to 80 or 85% pre-COVID, it's well balanced across income groups. As you can see, whether you earn less than 100,000 rupees a year annually or over ₹1 million a year annually, the response rate does not vary that much. It's very close to around 73, 74%. For households that earn less than 100,000 rupees, it is slightly lower. It's about 70%. However, that's very little selective non-response. In particular, most of the reduction in response rates for this first category of households below 100,000 rupees of annual income is really from households earning less than 72,000 rupees per annum or less. They make up a very small fraction of the total sample, less than 3%. So really, we've done quite well in terms of balance across income groups. We can do the same thing in terms of balance by occupation groups. And you'll see that regardless of their occupation, whether you're a farmer, a business person, whether you're retired, whether you're salaried, whether you're a small trader, whether you get classified as another occupation, response rates are very, very fixed at around that 70% mark. There's a slight dip, very not even discernible in the case of small traders. So very selective non-response, again, very well balanced across occupational groups. Now, finally, we'd like to see the same thing, but by education group. Excuse me, there's a typo on the slide that should say education group. We have many different education groups. Let me take a second to explain this to you. We have different kinds of graduated households with college graduates in them. We have different kinds of households that don't have college graduates, but have people who have matriculated from school. We have households that are literate or semi-literate, households that aren't literate, and households for which an educational qualification doesn't apply because the number of people living in that household above a certain age, there aren't enough of them, and so they don't even get qualified. If you look at households that have graduates in them, regardless of the number of graduates that they have, and those are the four different kinds, whether you're a household full of graduates or a household with just a few graduates, the response rate is very steady. It's hovering around the 72 to 76 mark. If you look at households that have at least one person who has graduated from high school, again, response rates are very steady, in the same, very close to the national average of 74%. If the household has no college graduates and nobody that's matriculated from school, in that case, they would either qualify as a household of all literates if everybody says that they are literate, but they haven't graduated school, or some literates, in which case there is nobody in the household that has even completed school, and of the people in that household, some of them aren't even literate. That response rate is low. It's just 43% compared to all the other groups that are in their 70s. The same is true for illiterate households, and to a lesser degree is true for the households for which an educational classification is not applicable. Again, this might lead one to worry, if not for the fact that actually this is a very, very small proportion of the sample. Again, only about 3% of the sample fall into one of these three categories. So the vast majority, 97% of the sample, fall in one of the other educational group categories. And for those groups, the response rate is very, very stable. All right, so that takes you through some of the various different ways in which you can try and measure if there was balance in the survey. So far, we've seen what's happened to sample size, we've seen what's happened to response rates, and we've seen what happened to balance. Sample size increased, response rates have increased, balance has by and large been maintained in a wave that continues to be difficult because we have to survey while COVID rages through the country. Now, I'd like to switch gears and tell you a little bit about the stories that come out of the survey. The first of these stories is a story about what's happened to incomes in India. CMIA has reported extensively on employment and unemployment. We've also reported extensively on household sentiments. One of those stories that Mahesh has written, in fact, recently, and has discussed also on news channels, is that a large proportion of households across India have reported that their incomes are less than they were a year ago. Let's try and unpack that for some of you and see really what's happened to incomes across the country. This is a graph of average monthly household income in nominal terms. That means that it's not been adjusted for inflation. The graph starts in January of 2019. That's 2 years ago, and goes until January of 2021. January of 2021 was the first month of wave 22. We all know that there was a steep drop in early 2020 corresponding to the first wave of lockdowns and the first wave of COVID in India. After that, there was a sharp recovery until June of 2020. That was promising news to many of us. It did look like a V-shaped recovery. Then that V started to flatten out a little bit. There was a slower recovery until October of 2020. And then after that, it really started to stagnate until January of 2020. And so in January, average monthly household income was just a little bit over 19,000 rupees per month. If you look at the dashed gray line, That's a visual reference to help you see that that point, 19,231, was lower than every single month in the year of 2019. And keep in mind that this is in nominal terms. If you additionally adjusted this for real terms, you would see an even more stark pattern. And when you look at this graph, you might have been tempted to say, hold on, this might be because Consumer Pyramids Household Survey is not able to capture people across the income distribution appropriately because of COVID or because of their survey design. But hopefully, by now, those questions should be taken care of because we've gone through the trouble of demonstrating to you that response rates have been high, they've been uniform, and that there is balance in the sample and in the survey execution. That should give you confidence in being able to look at this picture and say, yes, okay, what we are seeing here is an accurate reflection of what has happened in India over the last 2 years when it comes to monthly household income. That's the first story that we have for you today. The second story is a story about consumer demand. Now, what I'm going to show you are answers to questions that we pose to households in every round of the survey, not about whether they own assets, which we do ask, but about whether they intend to purchase assets in the future. So we also ask for every asset that we capture ownership information for, we ask, do you intend to purchase any of these assets in the next 4 months? Why 4 months? Because that's the time it takes for us to visit the household again. Every round takes 4 months, every round of the survey. Now, if you look at the answers to those questions for some of the most common categories of intention to purchase, I'm going to show you data across 4 waves that will take you through 1 year. Wave 19 was January to April of 2020. Wave 20 was May to August of 2020. Wave 21 was September to December of 2020. And wave 22 is the wave that we're discussing today, which is the most recent wave, which ended in April of 2021. That gives you 1 year and through the first cycle of COVID to see what's happened to asset ownership and asset purchase intentions. This is the fraction of households that intended to purchase any of these assets in the coming 4 months when they were asked that question in January to April of last year. In cases of coolers and washing machines, 1% of all households, quite large, were considering purchasing one of these in the next 4 months. In the case of TVs, fridges, and two-wheelers, it was 0.7%, 0.8%, 0.42%, respectively. What's even more important to note than just these absolute numbers is to see what happened to this demand relatively over time. When COVID hit, there was a sharp drop in early 2020 in the intention of households to purchase any of these assets, an incredibly sharp drop. Then, in wave 21 that picked up, so in September to December 2020, many people talked about how consumer sentiment was rising and consumption demand was increasing. We can see that in the data. Households, in fact, did start saying that they were more likely to purchase these assets compared to the lowest point of last year, which was May to August. However, that increase in consumer sentiment was very short-lived because in January to April of 2021, all of those numbers across the board fell instead of rising. And keep in mind, this is January to April of this year. The second wave of lockdowns was only in April. So there were 3 months that were in a way uncorrupted by the second wave of lockdowns and the second wave of COVID in India. Despite that, there was such a drop in the intention to purchase any of these assets in the coming 4 months. Now, there are some more patterns here that we should look at. Let's take two-wheelers as a category. Two-wheeler demand, as of the most recent wave, is the closest to picking up to its pre-pandemic levels 1 year ago. Even then, two-wheeler demand is a third of what it was in January to April of 2020. Let's take the next category, TVs and fridges. Even though they have risen, they are still a fourth of the demand for these assets a year ago. And what's worse hit are heavy appliances like coolers and washing machines, where the demand today is a tenth of what it was a year ago. And keep in mind, especially for coolers and air conditioners, I'm not showing you air conditioners because there wasn't enough space on this slide, but we also have information on air conditioners. There's a lot of demand usually in January to April as households are getting ready for the summer. Despite that, the demand for coolers in January to April of this year was a tenth of the demand that was experienced for these items a year ago. CPHS collects information on other categories, for example, cars, livestock, tractors, generator sets, etc. All of this data is there. It's available in CPHS for you to analyze and for you to look at. We're just showing you some of the stories that we are seeing in some important and noteworthy categories when it comes to future intentions to purchase assets across different asset classes across India. Of course, there are more patterns here, trying to understand how this demand varies depending on income group, depending on where you live, depending on urban households versus rural households. All of that work can be done with CPHS. This is just telling you a very broad story at the national level. All right. Now, the third and final story from the data, rather than about the data, is about how where you work matters to your job. Mahesh, in his columns on employment and unemployment, has been writing about this, has been writing about employment and unemployment, but also about the different kinds of work that people do and the different kinds of recoveries that we are seeing, depending on the kind of work that they do. That takes advantage of some of the richness in the CPHS data, but the CPHS data on employment is even richer. For people who are employed, we know physically where they would be working. We know whether they're full-time or part-time workers. We know the kind of employment arrangement they enjoy. So what is their attachment to the labor force? Are they salaried? Are they casual daily wage workers? Are they self-employed? Are they entrepreneurs, etc.? We know the industry that they work in. We know the kind of occupation they perform. For example, are you a barber? Are you a bricklayer? Do you work in a mandi, etc.? All of that data is there. And that's available for researchers to use in getting an even more detailed picture of what's happening to employment in India. In this talk, we're taking just one of those indicators, which is called place of work, and demonstrating to you the patterns that you can so clearly see when you look at the kinds of places that people work in. Let's take company jobs to begin with. That's you work for a company, okay? You don't work in a marketplace. You're not self-employed. You don't work in a farm. You don't work in a government office. You work for a company, right? These are the people that we're studying right now. And even when you work for a company, you could be in two kinds of different work. You could be working for a company and you could be working in an office. Or you could be working for a company and you could be working, but not in an office, maybe in a factory, maybe in a warehouse, maybe in a laboratory, maybe in all kinds of settings, but not an office job, right? Now, let's look at the different trajectories that people that worked in companies had from last year to this year, depending on whether they had office jobs in a company or whether they had a non-office job in a company. First of all, non-office jobs hugely outweigh office jobs for companies. So for every one person that works in a company and works in an office, there are 4 people working in a company that don't work in an office. They could be running around doing errands, they could be working in factories, etc. Okay? This is the state of company employment in January of last year, just before the lockdown hit. 10 million people in company offices, 40 million people in company non-offices. Then, when the lockdown hits, company office employment hardly budges, stays at exactly 10 million. But company non-office employment falls to 31 million from 41 million. Then in the wave after that, September to December of last year, company office employment still doesn't budge. It stays exactly the same at 10 million. And company non-office employment continues to basically not recover, still stays very subdued at 32 million. And then finally, in the most recent wave, you see that company office employment continues to remain stable. And there is a slight increase in company non-office employment. So office workers working in companies were quite safe through the pandemic and through the lockdown. This stands to reason because they are probably much more likely to be able to transition into work from home environments. Whereas people that weren't working in offices but still worked in companies were the people that were really hit by the pandemic and by the lockdown last year. And that category of workers has still stayed down relative to where they were before the pandemic. There are only 36 million people working in companies in non office settings today compared to 41 million people a year ago. Okay? This is a very stark and very interesting story about how the kind of place that you work in, even as long as you work in a company, just whether you have an office job or not, makes a huge difference to the recovery process as far as jobs are concerned. Now, this isn't true just for company jobs. This is equally true even in sectors as different as agriculture. So let's look at what happened to agricultural employment. If you said you were working on a farm as your place of work, and there could be different kinds of farm work. You could be working for someone, you could be working on your own farm, you could be in a bhagidari kind of farm work where there's some kind of revenue sharing or profit sharing. As long as you work on a farm, you're included in the graph on the right-hand side. In 2020, 144 million people, note the difference in scale, 144 million people worked in agriculture pre-pandemic. When the pandemic hit in May to August, unlike what happened to the case of companies, agricultural employment shot up. It soaked in all the excess labor supply. People that lost jobs went into agriculture as a source of work. And it shot up from 144 million to 157 million people working in agriculture. Then, as the economy reopened, people transitioned out of the farms back into the labor force. And so you see it dropping from 157 million down to 153 million in September to December of last year. Now, hopefully, as the economy continued to open up, as industry continued to turn back on, we should hope to see that this overheating that we saw in May to August comes down, gets closer to the levels that we're used to seeing. And keep in mind that the next bar you're going to see is going to be January to April, a year from the 144 million that you see on the left-hand side of your screens. Instead, that number didn't budge. In January to April of this year, 153 million people continued to be employed on farms across India. Now, this is worrying because this number, 153 million, in January to April 2020 is much higher, 2021, excuse me, is much higher than the January to April 2020 number. Agricultural employment tends to be seasonal, so you should see some fluctuations in agricultural employment. However, if you compare like to likes, January to April of this year should be compared to January of April last year. And we're at 153 million people working in agriculture in January to April of this year compared to 144 million last year. It's not just last year. Even if you compared this to Jan to April of 2019, you can see the dotted line that shows you what that mark was 2 years ago. In fact, you can even go 3 years back, and Jan to April 2018 agricultural employment is even lower. So Jan to April tends to be a low point in terms of agricultural employment. Despite that, we are at the highest agricultural employment in Jan to April that we've ever seen since we've started to collect data on this. Again, just knowing where somebody works, the place of work, helps you see such interesting patterns that might not come out from questions just about employment, unemployment, about rural, urban, etc. All of these indicators are there in CPHS. Our intention here is to just show you one example on employment, and we've done that here. We encourage all of you to dig into the data and find other stories about what's happening to workers over this year. That's it in terms of stories today. We've given you 3 stories on how we ran the survey in Wave 22 with the aim of convincing you that we ran the survey well enough that you can use the data to create stories about India. Then we showed you 3 stories about India that came out of the data that we had collected just in the wave prior, that's from January to April of last year. But some of you may not be satisfied with this. Some of you might be saying, I want to know more about the reasons for non-response. And you didn't tell me enough. You just told me that household refusal was 1.46%, but how many households were locked? Well, I can tell you the answer. The answer is, in fact, fewer households were locked since the pandemic than ever before, because there are more households that where the members of the household were actually there. You could say, how many households were rejected because of data quality issues? I can tell you the answer. It's a very, very tiny sliver, imperceptibly small. You could ask all kinds of other questions, and you're welcome to ask those questions. And I don't want to preempt every one of those questions because there are so many questions that can come. And surely I can't answer all of those questions for you. So what we've done as of today, and this is already live on our website, is we've introduced a brand new section to our website, which is all about studying how the survey was conducted. If you go to our website, which is consumerpyramidsdx.com, and you click on how we do it, which is on the top left-hand side, you will see a new option called response rates. If you click on that, you will see this table here. Okay. This table, or rather this website, which has a collection of tables, is what I used to make this presentation today. All of the tables that I have used are available to all of you to use. And I couldn't have used all of the tables because there are over 7,800 tables here on survey execution. You can cut the data by month, by wave, by all kinds of different categories. And you can look at information at an all India level. You can look at information state by state if you wish. There is a lot here. Our intention in making this data available is, one, to be able to tell you the audience stories, but also to help you see for yourself how survey execution happens in real time. And we hope that you use this to ask us questions and question us and say, what happened here? What happened there? Why was this the way it was? We look forward to those questions because we aim to improve our processes as we become more transparent in telling the world about how the survey is run. And not only are we going to provide you with these 7,800 tables on survey execution, which you can get at our website, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com, we're also going to give you regular analysis on our website. One way we're going to do this analysis is that we are going to convene a session like today's every time a wave is completed to tell you about what happened in the previous wave and to tell you some interesting stories. But beyond that, beyond doing one event once every 4 months, we are going to aggressively and regularly and consistently going to be writing analysis from this data on our website to help you understand why we see the patterns that we do, for us to improve our survey mechanism and our execution processes and our quality assurance processes, and for you to have confidence that we're running the survey well. In fact, just today, 3 new articles are up on the homepage, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com, all written by Mahesh on topics that we have covered in this talk. The difference is that each of these analyses by Mahesh is more detailed and gives you perhaps answers to some of the questions that you already have. Whether it's about household income balance, whether it's about regional balance in terms of urban, rural, whether it's about overall response rates when we're surveying in the lockdown, there are already articles available on the website. I believe that as this talk is happening, Mahesh has added a 4th article. There will be more and more of these articles at a very regular frequency. So please come to our website, come as often as you can. There will always be something new and exciting for you to learn about how we've conducted the survey and what we've learned from it. That's the first thing that I'd like to say to you, for those people that want to know more about how we executed the survey. There, of course, might also be people who want more stories, who want to know more than just one story on income, one story on consumer demand, one story on the place that you might work in. You might want to know stories about health. You might want to know stories about expenditure. You might want to know stories about all kinds of other things because we collect so much data. What can we offer you? Well, one thing we can offer you is that we have a monthly seminar series. That's where other people that use our data, not us. Our job is to produce the data and ensure that the data that we produce is high quality. Other people who are experts at research present their findings. If you aren't already signed up for our monthly seminars on research findings, please do sign up. Every month, there's a new and exciting talk. Next month, we're going to have one very exciting talk on electricity consumption across India and how it's varied in terms of availability, and potentially many other interesting talks on different areas across the months, every month, month on month. So please come to our research seminars. In addition, the data is out there. So if you go to our website, consumerpyramidsdx.com, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com, I think Earlier, I had said consumerpyramidsdx.com as well. If you go to our website, the data is available for any subscriber of Consumer Pyramids DX to download. And that data is available at the same time as that data becomes available to anybody else, including people at CMI. The wave that ended on April of this year, that data is already available for you to analyze. In fact, that data was made available for anybody to analyze on the 1st of May, the day after survey execution was completed. You can go to our website, you can download that data, you can download any of the historical data, as long as you have a subscription, and you can use that data to come up with more stories. Now, you might be wondering, okay, do I have a subscription? You might, for many of you, because most institutions in India and several institutions across the world now have access to CPDX. Just get in touch with us if you're interested in knowing whether you have a subscription. If you'd like to get access, there's a helpful little button. By the way, again, our website is consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. There's a helpful little button up there called Request Subscription. Click on that, and you'll be able to send us a message, and we'll be able to tell you whether you already have subscription. And if not, we'll be very happy to help you get subscription. Once you have access to the data, you'll have the same data at your disposal that we have at CMI and that everybody else has that uses this data. There are so many interesting stories out there. Like I said, our job at CMI primarily is to produce the data and ensuring that the people that use our data have confidence in it. We hope that you will use our data in coming up with more of these stories. There's so much out there. There are already 30 papers and counting. There'll be many, many more in the near future. And we encourage you to explore many of the indicators that people haven't yet bothered to look at. There are stories in every single indicator in CPTX. And really, that's our message for today. So thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to the stories from Wave 22. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. My email address is kkrishnan@cmi.com. Like I said, my co-host today is Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is the MD and CEO at CMI and the chief and principal architect of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. He knows more about the survey than anybody else. His email address is mahesh@cmi.com. Both of us are happy to receive your emails. We love to answer questions about the survey. I could see lots of questions getting asked while I was giving the talk, and I could see Mahesh typing away and giving answers to those questions. We finished with just 5 minutes to spare, and we can now open it up to additional questions. Thank you so much again for coming. I can see there are 38 questions in the chat box, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and hand it over to Mahesh. Mahesh, any thoughts, any questions that have come up repeatedly that you'd like to take a second to answer on video?
Well, there have been lots of questions. I have answered 52, and there are still 38 outstanding. There haven't been many repetitive questions. The questions have been mostly unique, and that's very interesting. So I haven't seen your presentation at all, Kaushik, because I was just banging away at the keyboard, answering as many questions as I could answer. So we still have a few questions, and let me see if we can answer them orally rather than by typing them out. So there's one which says, does the survey have found a significant change in the occupation structure of the individuals due to pandemic? We have this as an article put up by me today. You could look it up. I have answered this for somebody else already, and I've already given a link. And I can give a link over here as well if you give me a minute. Kaushik, if you can take up some of the other questions, I'll come back in a bit.
Sure, Mahesh. And I've just put up our screen again for anybody that's interested. Our website is on the bottom of that screen. It's consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. All the articles that Mahesh is talking about will be available there. While Mahesh is answering that question, let me take a stab at some of the other questions here. What is your take on respondent fatigue? Asks Apurva Gupta. Surveying households every 4 months with 600 plus variables, it's huge for a respondent to answer. Apurva, you're absolutely right. It is quite large. We do many things at CMI to reduce the fatigue that respondents face while answering these questions. The first of these things is that the entire survey, the entire interview that's conducted at the household is conversational. It's not that we sit there with a clipboard and we say, okay, what's your name? What's your age? What's your date of birth? What's your religion? What's your caste? What's your gender? Instead, we have a conversation with these households, and that changes the dynamic completely and makes them much happier to answer, less fatiguing to answer. We've done a series of talks on how we do the survey. I would encourage you to take a look at them. All of them are available on our YouTube channel. There'll be more documentation on this coming up soon. There's already a lot of documentation on our website. If you go to consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com, you will see that in the documentation section, there's a documentation on survey execution as well as on the questionnaire. Both of them will be very interesting and will tell you a lot about how we conduct the survey and how we're able to minimize household fatigue. Shamindra Roy has another question. Mahesh, I'm going to take a stab at this as well. I'm assuming you're still answering the earlier question.
I have answered that one, Kaushik. And this spatial granularity, you can answer this one. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, not at all. That's great. Shamindra has two questions. One is, what's the spatial granularity that's achievable in CPHS data? Two, what are the broad trends of migration from Wave 22? Okay, Shamindra, both of these are great questions. In terms of spatial granularity that can be achievable in CPHS data, in the files that you get access to as a subscriber, you will be able to see the state, the district, and whether the household corresponds to the rural or the urban part of that district. If it's the urban part of that district, whether they live in a large town, a very large town, a medium-sized town, or a small town. Now, each of these terms has a very specific meaning. Just to give you a rough idea, a small town has less than about 100,000 people in it, according to the 2011 census. A very large town would have a little over 1 million people in it, according to the 2011 census. So that much data on where the household is located is available in the record level, unit level data that you can get as a subscriber from the website. If you are interested in even higher granularity spatially, drop us an email. We'll be very happy to talk to you. We've been thinking about this and we would love to share our thoughts. But currently, this is what's available in the files that are available to subscribers. Your second question is very interesting. What are the broad trends on migration from Wave 22? Well, the short answer is we don't know. We've had so much data to analyze just to put this talk together. We've not yet looked at the migration data. I certainly haven't. Mahesh, I don't know if you have. Do you have any interesting stories for us, Mahesh, about migration happening in Wave 22?
In Wave 22, we yet need to study the data, Kaushik, to be able to answer that question correctly. I don't have an answer right now.
Great. I'll just say this much to tell Shamindra what's possible. We have hugely expanded our coverage in terms of migration. For every single in-migrant into the household, as well as out-migrant that leaves the household, we ask, what was the reason for their migration? Where did they go or where did they come from? So we know the state, the district, and whether it was the rural or urban part of that state or district. And we know this for every in-migrant or out-migrant in the survey. On top of that, for every person that lives in the household, we ask them whether they have any intention to migrate in the future. And if they say yes, we ask again, why, where would you go, and when are you likely to migrate? All of this data is available. It's very rich. It's a great question. What are the broad trends in migration? We don't yet know the answer. Perhaps there are other people that are using our data that are working on it. If not, now you know what's out there. You should please feel free to work on the data yourself. Catherine Chen asks, can I find a list of interview questions? Yes, you can, Catherine. It's at our website, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. Please click on how we do it. You will see a bunch of interesting rows. One of them is called the questionnaire. That's a PDF document, and that tells you why there isn't a questionnaire, but it's worth reading. Then there's a row called description of indicators. That will give you the full list of 600 plus indicators, and you can click on any of them to see the question construct, to see the different values that the indicator can take, etc. To do all of this, you need a CMI user ID and password that's free to create. If you have any trouble creating one, please let us know. All of the information on every single indicator we captured in the survey is collected there, including the actual screens for data capture that our field team uses when they capture the data in the field. Mahesh, I see you're already answering Manoj's question.
Yes.
Okay. Yashaswini asks, do you have any data on intention to buy luxury goods or discretionary goods other than ACs? Yes, we do. We have cars, and we have cars by segment. We also have two-wheelers and two-wheelers by segment. We have real estate. We have tractors, generators, cattle, livestock. Mahesh, what else would we have that are luxury goods in asset ownership? Other than cars and air conditioners. We have refrigerators, televisions, computers.
Well, all of them, I do not know how you classify luxury goods.
Yeah, neither do I.
But the assets are, I think there are a dozen of them. So a household, for a house or real estate is one. Is that a luxury? I do not know. If it's an additional one, obviously it's a luxury. But the first one is a necessity, maybe. Then there are transport goods like two-wheelers and cars. How do you call which one as a luxury? Maybe cars are luxury. Then you have televisions, refrigerators, air conditioners, coolers. Then you have cattle. So this is the broad list. Computers is there. Do you call computer a luxury? I do not know. So that's the broad list of assets we cover.
Thanks. Okay, Mahesh, I see that you are answering Surjit Bhalla's question, so I will move to the next question. Ananda asks if the numbers for office, non-office agricultural workers were out of the sample chosen. Ananda, I assume you're asking, is this from the responses that we collected in the most recent wave of the survey? The answer is yes. These are representative estimates, weighted to be representative of India as a whole, that are created from the data we captured in wave 22. Valerie Mercer Blackman says interesting results on office and non-office. And you ask further whether we'd be able to see anything about people who work on digital services. The answer again is yes. We have, Valerie, very detailed information on occupation. So you can look at IT workers, for example. We also have detailed information on industry. So you might be able to look at technology workers as an industry. So both through the occupational categorization as well as through industrial categorization, you will be able to see whether people that work on digital services have seen their employment go up or down. It's a great question, and I'm glad to say that we can answer it using the data that we have. SVD Nageshwara Rao asks if company and office staff working from home experienced salary and wage cuts. Another great question. It can be answered from the data. We don't know the answer to this question. We can only answer so many questions. And like I said, our primary responsibility is producing the data and answering questions about how the data was collected. That question, the one that you ask, can be answered. So we know whether people experienced wage cuts. And I encourage you to look into the data and find the answer to that question. Wow, Mahesh, we're getting more questions than we can answer. Mahesh, given that we have 49 questions here, may I suggest that you look through them and pick out a couple for us to just have a bit of a conversation on. And we may not be able to get through all of these questions, but what we can promise the audience is, since all of you have registered to the event, we have your email addresses. Many of you are people that we're in touch with and people that we know, which is great for us. And we will make sure that every single question that you have asked is answered. We'll send you an email. We'll make sure those questions are answered. Please keep your questions coming. But since we have a little bit of time left, Mahesh, I wonder, it might be a bit more interesting for the audience if you could pick out a couple of really interesting questions and answer them live.
Okay, can you run over this and I will try and answer them?
Yes, sure. Abhijit Mukhopadhyay has an interesting question. which is whether there's any pattern between consumer durables and consumer non-durables from an expenditure perspective in this wave. Have you seen anything already, Mahesh, in the data on this?
Sorry, what is the question?
The question is, do you see any pattern or differences in expenditure or consumer behavior when it comes to durables versus non-durables in the last wave?
Well, the decline in demand for durables is much higher. The decline is much higher than the demand for non-durables. So non-durables are largely, or at least to a large extent, essentials. So you can't stop spending, for example, for food and utilities, for example. So those are hit a lot less. We don't have the numbers right now, but that's my reasonably confident answer.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Anup Malani. Anup asks whether the change in the agricultural employment change in 2020, how does it compare to the change between 2020 and 2019? Anup, I hope I understood the question right.
Let me see. I don't think you can hear Anup. So I did see his question. How does the agriculture employment change in 2020 compared to 2019? Well, there is a big increase in employment in agriculture, Anup, because other forms of employment have shrunk, they have narrowed. And so people go back to their farms and declare that they are doing farming over there. This is mostly disguised unemployment. So there is an increase in 2020 in agriculture compared to 2019. During the pandemic, lots of people moved into what they call as farming or agriculture.
Thanks, Mahesh. Another question here from Shamim Mondal. Do you have any data on mortality due to COVID in households, especially for heads of households?
Well, I answered that question for Rosa Abraham. She had posted a similar question, and there are others who will have similar questions as well. All I can say is that CPHS was not designed to make estimates on mortality or birth rate, crude mortality rate or crude birth rates. But there are ways to get around this. They are not exactly easy. I think one can try to work around the limitations of the data to answer this question and then evaluate the answers before believing them. I would say the answer is not a clear yes to get mortality from this. The answer is one can try hard to find something and then evaluate whether those results make sense or not.
Great, thank you. Mahesh, I want to turn now to a question not so much about the data, not on the indicators that we collect, but there's an interesting question here from Sachin Gaikwad. We've covered this to some degree in earlier webinars, but it might still be interesting for this audience to hear it. What are the different techniques that we use in the survey as we execute interviews for data validation?
There are a lot of rules. I answered this question for somebody else, I think, and the question there was data validation or something similar. So we don't check the data against, say, tax records or bank statements. But we do check for internal consistency of the data. Number one, we ask a lot of detailed questions. How much did you earn from wages? How much from profits? How much from dividends? How much from interest? How much from transfers from the government or transfers from private, which could be your relatives from somewhere, and so on and so forth. So there's a detailed questionnaire which kind of forces the household to think a little more on getting all the sources of income enumerated, and we do this for all the members of the household. So it's quite detailed. So it becomes difficult for a person to escape, some source of information that did not come to your mind. That's number one. Number two, we take all this and aggregate it and turn around and ask the household. So this is what you earned, and they have to say, yeah, this is or this is not. And we compare it to the expenses and say it implies that you saved so much or you had this deficit. So there are various ways in which we cross-check the data for internal consistency from what the answers are that the household has provided. Now, since there are so many questions over here, it's not possible for a household to actually make up the whole questionnaire in a verbal communication. So internal consistencies is our best bet to ensure we get reliable answers.
Great, thank you. Now, another question on availability of indicators again. This is from Nisha Gupta. Nisha asks if we have data on food consumption. If so, can you tell us a little bit about it? Nisha in particular is interested in studying food consumption patterns in urban India.
So we can send you a link where you can see the entire list of indicators that come under food. But off the cuff, I can tell you that we have expenses on cereals, pulses, processed cereals and pulses, on vegetables, on potatoes and onions separately. I mean, potatoes and onions are separate from vegetables. We have things like dry spices, spices in general, milk, eggs, meat, fish. This is the rough thing. And then there are many others which are processed foods, which come in as well, including things like breakfast cereals, milk products. So that's what I can recall right now.
Great, thank you, Mahesh. I'll just also add to that answer. Nisha, there's a great paper that uses our food consumption data to estimate whether households can afford a nutritious and healthy diet. You can find the information on the paper, including the journal, the name of the paper, as well as its authors on our website. If you click on research using CPTX, it's one of the most recent papers published using our data. It's a great paper, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Mahesh, another question for you from Odysseia. Hi, Odysseia. Odysseia asks a question that I think we have discussed in an earlier webinar, but still an interesting question. When households don't respond, when do we drop them? How many households, how many waves in consecutive would they have to, for example, not respond for them to be dropped? And so, how is this reflected in the data? How much does it affect the stability of the sample in 2019 and 2020?
So a household has to refuse to respond to us for 3 consecutive waves for us to consider it to be dropped. Mind you, consider it to be dropped. So if a household has refused to respond to us, or if we have found the household to be locked and inaccessible for 3 consecutive waves, then the supervisors get into action to go and check to see why this is the case. And their investigation is very important. And they have to tell us that indeed this household cannot be a part of a panel because it is destroyed, demolished, or the household is insistent that they are not going to respond to us under any condition. No amount of persuasion will help, and so on and so forth. And then upon the recommendation of the supervisor, does the head office relent to remove that household from the panel? In the last few years, we have not even done that. What we have done is we have merely marked the household as dropped, but not actually dropped it. We're going to make a correction because there's a big collection of these dropped households in the sample now. They will all get dropped in the 24th wave. But we are very, very finicky over dropping households because there could be a tendency for the interviewers to drop all those households that are difficult to execute and retain those that are easy to execute. So we don't let it happen very easily.
Great, thanks, Mahesh. We have another question from Catherine Chen, who has already, while this talk has been going on, gone to our website, seen our description of indicators, and sees, for example, the stuff that we have on time use, because we have our own time use survey. And Catherine wants to know, do we have individual level data as well in CPHS, or is this only household level data? Of course, as you and I know, there's both individual level data as well as household data. But would you mind, in brief, talking a bit about this for others that might have a similar question about what's available at the individual level, what's available at the household level?
Well, time use is available at the individual level. So I think this is for all individuals who are more than 12 years of age, or if you remember this to be any different, there is a cutoff age, I think it is 12. For all people who are 12 or some such age, maybe even younger than that, we take a full detail of how much time did they spend on various activities, which could be for employment, which could be for household work, which could be for leisure. That whole thing is available for all members of the household. So there isn't anything, Kaushik, if I may correct you, as household level time you spent, because the time is spent by individuals and not by the household.
Absolutely, Mahesh. I mean, more generally in CPHS, what do we collect at the household level? What do we collect at the individual level? So just to add to what you said, Catherine and everybody else in the audience, we have a helpful color-coded background to this event for you. So everything that you see in, well, see, unfortunately, I am colorblind. So I will point to the color and you can figure out what color it is. Everything in this color is individual level characteristics. We have individual level income as well. Everything in this color, amenities, savings, assets, sentiment, etc., is household level. We also have household level income, household level consumption. So a lot of information, both at the individual level as well as at the household level. There was an additional question on time use, Mahesh, which is about, I'm sorry, just a point that you had said. You are right. We ask time use questions to all people in the household above the age of 12. I just wanted to add that. We're almost out of time, Mahesh. So I will take two more questions and then wrap up today's session. There's one question here from Partha Mukhopadhyay. You have answered it in one way or another before, but I think it bears repeating since the question has come up. Have you asked in CPHS, or do you plan to ask if a household member has been infected or died due to COVID?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part. Your voice trailed off.
Have you asked in CPHS or plan to ask if a household member has been infected or died due to COVID?
No, we haven't asked that question specifically. And death, as I said, is a complex thing. We do measure death, but deriving a death rate from there or crude death rate would be a little tricky question. That's all that I can say.
Thanks, Mahesh. We'll take.
I'd like to answer Sebastian.
Please do.
Can the approximate Google coordinate of the household be given with an accuracy of about 5 kilometers? Sebastian, we don't give the coordinates of the households. That's because we promise the households that their identities will not be revealed. But we have a service wherein we can answer your questions that can be answered only using those coordinates. So we could probably work together. I mean, there's an additional fee for this. And I'm sure IIM Ahmedabad will be able to give that much of a fee, but we can work around the problem if we work together, and we will make the exact coordinates or approximate coordinates of the households available for the research work, but that processing will be done partly inside CMI servers, and we will give you the results. But I think we have a note on that, and we'll share that with you and put it up on our site as well. There are many people who are asking us questions regarding how can we access the precise coordinates of the households. So we would like to help you out, Professor Sebastian.
Thank you, Mahesh. I'm so glad you brought that up. As you say, there's huge research interest in being able to get finer, more granular geolocated information on these households. We have an immense responsibility in ensuring that we do not leak personally identifying information about the respondents. And so we are very interested and keen in building this new service, a way for researchers to be able to take advantage of even more precise location data. And this is just, I think, one example of the many ways in which we are constantly, let me say, increasing and improving on what CPHS covers, what it delivers to researchers, and how it becomes useful for people to use. We are just 5 minutes short of the closing time. There are still over 40 questions, and there are new questions that have come up even since then. But I think that it's probably best for us now to end the session, and we will respond to all of the remaining 42 questions that are out there. And we make sure that each of you get precise answers to each question that you would like answered. Mahesh, unless there's any last question or two that you would like to answer, and it's all over to you, I'd like to wrap up the show for today.
No, there are so many very important and very very important questions that all require a very good answer. I'd like to take some time and answer each and every one of them over the next few days. So thank you very much, everyone, for asking all the questions and being in the show. We hope to give you credible answers, and if you don't find them credible, you can write back to us. We owe you an answer.
Superb. Mahesh, thanks for coming. Thank you for answering so many questions. Let's see, 82 questions answered. Great. So answering really almost a question a minute. I'm glad that there were so many questions. I'm glad that the audience found this useful. Please send us feedback. On Twitter, we are _CPHS. You can also write to us. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. My email address is kkrishnan@cmi.com. It was a real pleasure to have all of you today. We hope to be doing this every single wave. We hope that we can continue to give the research community that uses our data more insights into how the data is produced and into the quality of the data and ways in which it can be used. Mostly, thank you to the audience for coming. I know it's a late hour for those of you here in India, and it can be a little inconvenient for many of you outside of India. Despite that, we've had a really great audience and a tremendous number of extremely interesting questions. We are going to have our hands full for the next couple of days in answering these questions, but we're excited to do this. Please stay in touch with us. Please follow us on Twitter. Please check out our website often. There will always be new material there. Thank you, everybody, for coming again. Mahesh, thanks for your time. I'm going to bring this session to a close now. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.